Good early afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the report launch seminar. My name is Mika Aaltola, Director of the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. On my behalf, I'm very happy that this event has been put together by the great efforts of multiple contributors and collaborators. And I'm also very proud of the fact that FIIA, the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, has for many years been conducting pioneering world-class research in developing geoeconomics as an analytical framework and in study of geoeconomics as a foreign policy practice, a very timely topic in today's world. Indeed, we are witnessing a period of time where basically all things are weaponized in power politics, from financial to data flows, to infrastructure, and to even the most inhumane practices that are prevailing in today's world, such as co-option of migration waves. FIIA's current focus is on further strengthening, solidifying this research on geoeconomics as it is becoming ever more pertinent as a political practice. We need to analyze the multifaceted nature of it in the changing world. For FIIA, geoeconomics marks a strategic priority area that cuts across all our research programs and projects. Having been first movers when it comes to conceptualizing and studying geoeconomics, FIIA has also recently been successful in attracting substantial external funding for this work. And in this connection, I would like to thank our research professor, Dr. Wikell, and his team on being able to attract also external funding and external cooperation when it comes to our cross-cutting theme. We currently run a high number of externally funded projects, including a project on identifying and monitoring geoeconomic risk that is funded by the EU Commission. Another example is the project that has led to this report that is being presented here today under the title Europe Facing Geoeconomics, and which has been funded by the Finnish Prime Minister's Office. The research for this report has been conducted by researchers from ETLA, Economic Research, VTT, Technical Research Center of Finland, as well as from FIIA. The participants in the research team is a long list of names, but they need to be acknowledged and recognized for their great work. Mikael Wikell, that I already referred to, Matthias Deshyvere, Christian Fjeder, Niklas Helvik, Ville Kaitila, Heli Koski, Josi Seilonen, and Arho Suominen. They all did fantastic work in putting together this extensive report. Thanks also go to the steering group for this project that was led by Pia Sarivaara and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. This collaboration is greatly appreciated. The results in conceptualizing innovatively as well as deeply data-driven in the data-driven report, the important and crucial issue for Finland and EU, Finland being one of the avant-garde member states in this respect. And I think it provides solid policy advice on how Europe and Finland needs to adapt to the new era of economic and technological rivalry. I'm very pleased that Director General Sabine Weyand from the EU Commission is joining us for this seminar and conversation this afternoon, and for paying attention to this report and to the important issues discussed here today. We are also very grateful that the Undersecretary of State, Nina Paskunlahti from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is here to provide her remarks and insights. In addition, we have a panel with prominent experts from Business Finland, the National Emergency Supply Agency, as well as the Confederation of Finnish Industries. They will all present in more detail their work and contributions and insights at the later stage. So, very warm welcome from my behalf to this launch seminar, and I will now yield the floor to Pia, who is going to chair the event and who was also the chair of the steering group behind the common effort. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mika. Dear Director General, Ms. Weyand, Under Secretary of State, Ms. Paskunlahti, Your Excellencies online, distinguished researchers and participants of this hybrid event, and colleagues, of course. Thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to welcome you all in this hybrid event in my capacity as the chair of the steering group for this research project. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Pia Sarivara, as was said, and I am a Finnish diplomat with a long background in Finnish-Russia relations, especially from trade and economic perspective. I have also worked in business. I have worked as a ministerial advisor in Russia and US affairs in the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment, and currently I am following China's economic and political development, and also mostly from trade and business perspective. Actually, this research project that we are now talking about has continued the work that we started last year in the MFA together with the Confederation of Finnish Industries. We had more than 40 specialists studying the US-China superpower rivalry and its implications for Finnish companies. In that project, we looked into sanctions, export control, standardization, financing, and market access issues. We concluded that the rivalry has significant consequences for Finnish companies, and we also concluded that in order to have up-to-date situational picture and response to geopolitical changes, we need more national coordination and, of course, EU action. And also more research is needed, as shows this current project. Final report of our study was published last June, and it's available on the government publications website. The research in question today has been part of government's research project called VNTA's Government's Analysis, Assessment and Research Activities. It means that the government funded research on a topic that was actual and needed. The research report itself represents the view and analysis of the research group. As by the rule, the research project has had a steering group consisting of representatives from different ministries and Prime Minister's office to make sure that various national viewpoints are studied in the project. At this point, I would like to thank the steering group members for their input, but most of all, I would like to thank the researchers, the consortium, FIIA, ETLA and VTT for the valuable research. I will not talk about geopolitics and geoeconomics that much now. Our Undersecretary of State will run through the international big picture and how this piece of research fits into that. I want to point out the importance of research in general, especially in the economic field. Very often at work we run into a situation that we don't have enough information on Finland's external economic relations. For example, what has happened to our trade? How does the export structure look like? How do the value chains look like? What does it mean for our competitiveness and Finland's economy in whole? What are the risks related to this? And how does the future look like, taking into consideration the geopolitical changes? Our main market and main partner, of course, is the European Union and its member states. But outside the EU, our main economic partners are the US, China and Russia, if we look at trade, investments and our companies' presence, so meaning from the economic perspective. So how are these markets developing? How are the geopolitical changes affecting the markets? And what does it mean, not only for the companies, but also for Finland as a whole? The current research report gives some answers, but not enough. In Finland, research, for example, on Russia and Russia's economy is strong and has traditionally been strong. But still often the practical economic part is missing. You probably remember the Finnish participants, the grand old man on Russia's economic research, Mr. Pekka Sutela, who passed away not that long time ago. It's good that there are people who still continue in his steps on the path of Russia's economic research. But compared to Russia, China is less studied in Finland. And it is good that China research is also being built up now. In the time of hybrid information campaigns and fake information, it is important to have reliable information. Factual information is needed for the decision makers to base their decisions on. In Finland, we talk about tiedolla johtaminen, leading with knowledge. Finally, I would like to conclude with a citation about the task of researchers and state leadership role. Quote, "Researchers analyze the operations of international systems, statesmen build them. Researcher has available to statesmen all the facts. The statesman must act on assessments that cannot be proved at the time when the assessments are made. He will be judged by history on the basis on how wisely he managed the inevitable change and above all, how well he preserves the peace." Unquote. The research report published today talks about, as it seems, the inevitable change and its implications. It remains the task for the decision makers to make the use of the research. With these words, I would like to welcome you to this hybrid seminar, and please enjoy the report too. It's only a little bit less than 160 pages, with a summary, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pia, and very welcome on my behalf to this seminar as well. My name is Mikael Vigel, and I work as the research director at FIIA. And it's indeed my great pleasure to welcome Director General Sabine Weyand to participate in this seminar. I think in this seminar, I think we're indeed very grateful for your participation, and also I believe that we agreed that Ms. Weyand will take a few questions right after her remarks, and those questions can be put in the chat function. Indeed, Ms. Sabine Weyand is Director General of Trade at the European Commission. Before becoming Director General, Ms. Weyand served in several roles at the Commission. Deputy Chief Negotiator of the Commission Task Force of the negotiation with the UK between 2016 and 2019. Director in the Secretariat General of the Commission in charge of policy coordination on economic, social issues, environmental policies. She also served in the cabinets of Trade Commissioner Pascal Lamy and Commission President Barroso, as well as heading the office of Development Commissioner Louis Michel. We're indeed very grateful for your participation, and the floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me for the presentation of this very important and interesting report, which is really addressing one of the key challenges we are currently all confronted with. You know, I'm old enough, and we've just heard my CV. I'm old enough to remember the good old days when trade policy could basically function more or less insulated from political developments and geopolitical tensions. Those days are past, and we now have to see how can we manage the challenges of our geoeconomic environment in which we are all operating now. And studies such as the report by the Institute that I have been able to have a look at in preparation of this event help us indeed to lead with knowledge. So I'm very happy to be able to participate, even if I would have preferred to do this in Helsinki directly, because exchanging with a screen is always a bit of a challenge, even if in 2 years of the pandemic, we've now all gotten used to it. Now, even without the recent security challenges in our neighborhood, Europe is navigating a particularly tense geopolitical environment these days, marked by the US-China strategic competition, the crisis of multilateralism, and trade being increasingly weaponized in a geoeconomic context. So how do you craft and carry out an effective trade policy under these circumstances? The Trade Policy Review, our new EU trade policy strategy, which we published almost a year ago, aims at shaping a new consensus for an open, sustainable, and assertive trade policy centered around the concept of open strategic autonomy. I think it is important to recall that the EU derives its strength from openness, and that we need more than ever to continue to rely on open rules-based trade to recover from the crisis, to remain competitive, to build alliances, and to shape global solutions to the global problems we are faced with. We are therefore committed to reform the WTO, to build bilateral partnerships under our FTA agenda and beyond, and to ensure that the trade agreements we negotiate are ratified, implemented, and enforced. But with openness comes interdependence that needs to be managed carefully in order to reap the full benefits of trade, while at the same time addressing our vulnerabilities. We need to equip ourselves to respond to situations where others weaponize trade and exploit our openness. Open strategic autonomy means that we stand ready to assertively defend our interests and values on our own, where we must, together with like-minded countries wherever we can. And here I'm particularly counting on the transatlantic partnership, which I think has moved in a very positive direction over the last year. We've been able to lower the temperature on long-standing conflicts, to find at least temporary solutions on some of the problems that have beset the bilateral relationship, which has allowed us to move forward and start building a positive agenda. And here I am particularly referring to the Trade and Technology Council, which covers issues such as cooperation on technology standards and supply chain resilience. Because it is these issues which are at the nexus of trade, technology, and security, which will decide where Europe will be heading and to what extent we will be able to shape the global environment around us. And here we have developed our toolbox recently. We have, for instance, upgraded our export controls regulation. We have created a new framework for screening investment under security and public order objectives. We have also very recently, just before Christmas, presented a proposal for an anti-coercion instrument to protect the interests of the EU and the member states by being better equipped to deter and counteract coercive actions from third countries. These tools should be seen together with efforts for the EU to become more resilient, efforts which we are currently underway, both in the trade and in other fields. In the trade area, the aim is to secure diversified sources of supply in order to be less vulnerable to coercion, to be less dependent on single sources of supply, by working to reform the multilateral trading system and to conclude and implement trade agreements with partners around the world. The Commission also adopted a communication in January last year in the area of financial services to promote the international role of the euro, to amend the blocking statute and ensure a more robust financial infrastructure. And the actions deriving from that communication are being rolled out currently. Needless to say, the starting point for our resilience is doing our homework. That is to make sure that we have a competitive single market at home. We are only strong internationally if we are strong internally. The update of the industrial strategy that the Commission presented last May shows the importance of an open, integrated, competitive and well-functioning single market as one of our key assets, but also the need to assess and, where necessary, address strategic dependencies in specific sectors. This work is ongoing, with a second installment coming up later this month. Also key in this context is the proposal addressing distortions derived from foreign subsidies in the single market, a proposal that is currently going through the legislative process. This past year has shown how sensitive global markets are to supply and demand imbalances in a recovery phase, and we have seen significant challenges to meet EU demand at competitive prices in sectors such as semiconductors and raw materials, which are crucial for our Green Deal and for the digital transformation of our economies. Now, of course, much of the responsibility for improved resilience of supply chains lies with industry itself, which should strengthen measures and policies to improve resilience through, for instance, supply diversification. I think here we need to move from a focus on just in time to a focus on just in case. We will in turn provide support in a smart and targeted manner to remain competitive and innovate, further develop trading relationships with key partners, and we will not hesitate to enforce rules in order to ensure that trade is both open and fair. So how then to deliver in the era of geoeconomics? Here I see a number of challenges for EU trade policy: to remain open, resist protectionism, and to ensure that the support we provide is well targeted, to ensure a coordinated global recovery and a meaningful WTO, and to cooperate with like-minded partners on standards and innovation, to position ourselves more assertively, speak with one voice in the EU, but also externally, and to put all new and existing tools to good use. All this requires better consistency and coordination across internal and external policies, also across policies handled at member states level and those handled at EU level, and also better coordination with like-minded partners and all stakeholders in order to deliver. For instance, cooperation is vital for both FDI screening and export controls that I already mentioned. And here I would like to take the opportunity to encourage Finland to make full use and participate actively in the cooperation mechanism. We are also engaging in cooperation with like-minded countries. We have set up dedicated working groups under the Trade and Technology Council between the EU and the US, which are meeting regularly since last November. And we are, of course, also meeting notably our Japanese counterparts. But while we are beefing up our defenses and putting new preparedness mechanisms in place, we should not lose sight of the core objective of trade policy as a driver for growth and competitiveness. It is trade that connects us to global growth centers and allows us to play a role on global developments. So I think this is an absolutely essential part of our policy. I have tried to sketch out the Commission's approach to these matters. We are still, I think, in full swing in really anchoring this new consensus about the direction of trade policy built around the concept of open strategic autonomy in the EU. And I think reports such as the one by FIIA contribute greatly to a shared understanding of the challenges and are therefore the basis to also develop a consensus on the solutions. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Unfortunately, I have a timing constraint and will have to leave you in 35 minutes. But I'm very happy to take any questions you may have now. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for providing your views, Ms. Weyand, and indeed, I think that was a very nice summary of many things that are going on, and a lot is going on. I was wondering about export controls, perhaps, and what's the kind of the debate right now on those, and what's happening there's some discussion on export controls right now, but what's your view on that?
So I think we have to recognize that, the role of export control is the traditional one of dealing with the dual-use goods and to make sure that technology does not end up where it's not supposed to end up. And here, of course, traditionally, we are in a situation where our export controls in the EU are very much just focused or even limited to what is being done, what is being controlled under the multilateral regimes, Wassenaar, etc. What we have seen, however, is that that may not be sufficient. So I think this is a policy which is in evolution, reflecting again how the world around us develops. We have just recently concluded a review of our export control regime, which first of all widens the scope to products that can be used in surveillance. So it widens the scope of products that can be looked at, but it also creates for the first time the possibility within strict limits, but it provides for the possibility of EU autonomous action. And I think that is necessary because, as I said, we are at this juncture of trade, technology, and security. And that we have to make sure that our policy framework and our ability to control is in keeping or keeps up with the developments we see in the technology field and the possibility of technology being used against the EU and against our interests and values. So I think it is something where we need to continue working together, and we first need to make sure that we apply our new framework properly, but we also need to see whether what we have is sufficient to tackle the challenges we are currently seeing, and the possibility of technology not only to undermine peace, but also the foundations of democracy. So I really think that that requires a fresh and more comprehensive look at the issue of export controls. And I think I would leave it there for the moment.
Thank you. There are a few questions in our chat function concerning trade agreements, and given your also what you said about trade policy no longer being isolated from the rest from political development, so to speak, there's a question whether how we can guarantee that the EU trade policy with EU trade agreements still will contribute concrete results in market access and better level playing field, and that any agreement is often better than no agreements at all in building rules for rules-based free trade. Would you like to comment on that?
That is, of course, a very easy question, which lends itself to a 30-second answer. No, but I think it goes to the heart of the question of what is trade policy about. First of all, trade finds a way to flow, whatever. And I think we have an interest to make sure that trade flows on the basis of clearly established rules. The basics of these are in the WTO. The WTO is still, even if it is currently very fragile, but it is still our best protection against arbitrary discrimination. I think we really have to preserve that as a basis. Then what we do with our bilateral trade agreements is to build upon this very basic foundation of non-discrimination that we have in the WTO. And here we are indeed looking at how can we build privileged relations which go hand in hand with a higher degree of mutual commitment. The challenge we have in our free trade agreements is, and there are lots of issues where we have built rules ranging from regulatory cooperation to intellectual property protection to sustainable development, which is very much a focus we have now, and which we are continuing to develop with the review of our trade and sustainable development approaches, which we are currently carrying out, and where we hope to come with the result by the middle of the year. But what I think we need to keep in mind is what we put in these agreements has to be attractive for both sides. So it has to be also negotiable, and there has to be a trade link with it. So when we talk about trade and sustainable development, we have to make sure that the trade we create through these agreements is not to the detriment of the environment and does not lead to an undermining of core labor standards or multilateral environmental agreements, etc. So that is why, but we want to go further than that. So we want to go further than the do no harm principle, which is very important, but not sufficient. We also want to use, and we do use, our trade agreements as platforms for cooperation on a wide array of global challenges, from climate change to biodiversity, respect of ILO core labor standards, etc. And we see that we here have a level of engagement and cooperation which you do not have outside the agreement. Now, where we need to be careful is that we do not try and solve every problem under the sun through trade agreements, because that would overload the issue and would make commitments difficult to negotiate. So if you ask the question, and I think that was the beginning of the question, how can you make sure that trade agreements actually deliver? Have a look at our report on the implementation of free trade agreements. First of all, you see that trade with countries with whom we have a privileged trade relationship grow more strongly than with countries with which we do not have such a privileged framework. Secondly, you also see the examples of how we are using these agreements as platforms for cooperation, whether that is core labor standards in Korea, whether that is cooperation on environmental challenges across the board, whether that is trade and gender. There's a whole lot of issues where indeed we can show that our trade agreements deliver on a wide array of issues. They deliver on the trading part, on the economic, the growth and jobs part, but also on the societal concerns on which we want to work with countries. And of course, what you see is that beyond the economic, the classical drive for trade agreements, what you see is that there is also now more and more of a geopolitical push to say we need partners in this world, which has become overall more hostile and where there is a clear shift from a rules-based environment to a power-based environment. So we need friends and allies. And the way to do that at EU level is through trade agreements. So we just have to make sure that we do not pretend that a trade agreement, even as a platform for cooperation, can exhaust everything we need to do with other third countries. I think we need to also develop other types of agreements with countries in order to be able to cooperate, whether it is on challenges of climate change or whether it is on tackling issues of non-proliferation. There's a wide array of other tools. At EU level, very often we tend to focus almost exclusively on trade, and that is at the risk of overburdening such agreements.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for participating here. We will now move on we continue with Ms. Nina Vaskunlahti, Undersecretary of State at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland since 2019. Ms. Vaskunlahti has served in many functions at the Ministry, including as Ambassador of Finland to India and Bangladesh, as Ambassador to Turkey, as Director General of the Department for Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and she has also held various functions at the Finnish Permanent Representation in Brussels. So thank you very much for taking time, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mikael. Thank you very much for inviting me along. Good afternoon to everybody here in the room via FIIA, to all of you online, and Sabine, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Always good to hear your thoughts. The publication of the FIIA report, Europe Facing Geoeconomics, is both very timely and relevant. Economic issues are increasingly intertwined with political and security issues. The report underlines how the geopolitical and geoeconomic situation has been changing rapidly during the last few years. The international security landscape has also changed significantly, not only due to superpower rivalry in Asia, but also in our own neighborhood. The situation regarding Russia and Ukraine is tense. Intense diplomatic contacts regarding European security are taking place. Dialogue and diplomacy are crucially important in this situation, as they always are. Our message has been clear. There can be no compromises on the basic principles of the European security. The concept new normal was adopted some time ago to describe the geopolitical landscape, but I would say that the concept of new normal is already a worn-out saying. I think instead we need to talk about constantly changing new normal. We faced a coronavirus pandemic 2 years ago. After several waves of virus variants, it looks like that we will live with the virus mutations for some time to come. This is also part of the changing new normal. Great power rivalry between US and China has intensified, especially in the technological domain. We cannot escape its impacts. Global geopolitical focus has also shifted more on Asia. New old political formations like Quad and AUKUS emphasize the need to rebalance the power setting and to sustain peace and security in the region. The EU has approved its strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. The climate change is one of the biggest challenges of our time. Achieving climate neutrality and implementing green transition require serious political commitment globally. And it requires looking beyond geopolitical competition. Henry Kissinger wrote in his book on diplomacy, superpowers try to be the international system, not just a part of it. There are countries challenging the established international rules-based order and the society models of democratic countries. Long-established international organizations such as the UN and the WTO are often challenged and sidelined by some of their members. For a small, open economy like Finland, the international law and multilateral rules-based system are the cornerstones. We need to strengthen the foundations of democracy and democratic institutions. Democracy is not something we can take for granted, but we have to keep on checking and reinforcing the building blocks of democracy. We also need to address the geopolitical changes according to our standards and values. For the companies, the new normal, the new changing normal, means increasing risks, both financial and political. As the studies show, the superpower rivalry has already had an impact on business. The world has become much more complicated. As noted in the study, what was previously seen as positive interdependence is now viewed as potentially dangerous dependence. The changing new normal requires more cooperation with like-minded countries sharing the same values. Together, we need to build up our resilience in the changing political environment. The EU is in itself a product of multilateral cooperation and one of the staunchest defenders of multilateralism. Ladies and gentlemen, the report published today calls the European Union to strengthen its resilience and strategic autonomy. I can only agree on that. The resilience of the Union is even further reinforced by open, sustainable and assertive trade policy, as well described by Sabine earlier on. We need the instruments to defend our interests, to protect the EU's economy from unfair trade practices, and to ensure a level playing field for the companies. We also need free trade agreements, and we need to make sure that they are implemented. Trade, as stated by Sabine, is a driver for growth and prosperity. The recently requested consultations by the EU at the WTO with China concerning the treatment of Lithuanian products and components is a good example of the EU solidarity and unity. It emphasizes both the use of existing international mechanism, in this case the WTO, and the strength of the EU as one trading bloc. The EU is exposed to geoeconomics and rivalry. However, I consider it essential to have a balanced and at the same time realistic approach to the superpowers. With the US, we share an important transatlantic relationship. Our relationship with China is well defined, China being a negotiating partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. The report published today has important conclusions and recommendations concerning Finland and, of course, the European Union, calling for more resilient and competitive economy at home and reinforced by security of supply and resilience. I somehow hear the states being called back. We are ready to discuss, to assess, exchange information, and give the facts as we see them. However, we cannot decide on behalf of the companies. We will do our utmost to contribute to what I always call enabling environment for the business, be it on the national level, be it on the international level. We also need to look more carefully in the technical standards and work done in the relevant bodies as suggested in the study. The one who sets the standards is in charge of the future. Thus, I'm also looking forward to get more details concerning Commissioner Breton's announcement for the EU to become more of a standard setter than standard follower. Thank you once again for excellent work done to FIIA and all the researchers. The report will indeed be studied in detail and happy to keep on discussing. Thank you.
Indeed, for those views and for clarifying also a lot what comes to the Finnish position and for your kind words with regard to the report. And thanks again to both of you for your insights and taking time. I will now recap some of the main points of inquiry in this our report that was published today, and the policy implications we draw on the basis of our analysis. And I hope this will also help stimulate some further discussion. PowerPoint I have prepared is probably about to be shown here as well, I suppose. And I should also like to reiterate Mika Aaltola's point in his welcoming words about this being the fruit of a very stimulating cooperation between the Finnish Institute of National Affairs, Etla Economic Research, and VTT Technical Research Center of Finland. So this has really been a multidisciplinary research effort, gathering political, economic, and technological expertise from all three research institutes. And I think this multidisciplinary basis is really nicely reflected in this very dense and data-oriented report. The starting point for this report is really the rise of geoeconomics, so the increasing convergence between economic and security policies and the way economic interdependence and interconnectivity is increasingly seen by states to pose some security risks. So with geoeconomics, we refer to how states use economic instruments to further their strategic and security-related goals. In recent years, we've seen actors such as China, Russia, and the United States using trade and investment policies as a facet of grand strategy and security doctrine. Economic security has become a key or a central pillar of in grand strategic thinking, let's say. And this puts the EU and its member states in a bit of a difficult bind, and it also very much changes the risk picture, I think, and business environment for European companies. Why? Well, because the EU has been organized traditionally around the relative separation of the economic and security policy realms and the focus on shared economic gains and a very positive view of interdependence. And this setup served the EU very well in the post-Cold War era, that saw the proliferation of international economic agreements and cooperation. For European companies, this was also a time of economic liberalization, in which companies themselves very much set the tone and were in the driver's seat of economic globalization. This environment has now changed. The state is back, as we heard here before, and economic interdependencies and relationships are now cast in a bit of a different light. So instead of catalyzing cooperation around mutual economic gains, the external dependencies of Europe are now increasingly seen as potential vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities that can be leveraged by outside actors for power political ends, as for instance in the case of the ongoing Chinese trade blockade on Latvia. And the danger here is now that globalization starts to unravel as states begin to hedge against these risks and posed by interdependence, and starts to balance against dependence on foreign actors by more protectionist policies. So the key challenge here for the EU and its member states, such as Finland, that has been thriving on the rules-based global trading system, is to identify these risks involved with the rise of geoeconomics and gear up its resilience against them, but without resorting to unfounded protectionism that would further damage this rules-based system. And I think this is indeed the context around which the ongoing debate around the need to develop the EU's so-called open strategic autonomy should be understood, which I think Director General Vayan very well explained for as well. Behind this is the recognition that the EU and its member states need to better manage its interdependence with the outside world and better weigh the opportunities from global interdependence and against its risks. And when it comes to European businesses and investors, they will also need to reevaluate perhaps some long-held assumptions about the functioning of the global economy. So what we do in the first part of this report is that we look at the main changes involved with the rise of geoeconomics. So we identify three main changes that at the same time constitute perhaps three sources of risk for European companies. First, an increasing weaponization of the global economy by major states. So we're seeing an accelerating use of economic sanctions and espionage, including new generation financial sanctions, especially by the US, which although often directed against other targets than European, also have broad secondary effects on European companies. We're also seeing more actors using economic sanctions, such as China, which hasn't been using sanctions so much before. It hasn't been figuring in the toolbox, so to speak. Secondly, an increasing securitization of the economy, meaning more economic sectors are being intervened with for security purposes. So because of the weaponization of the economy and increasing strategic competition between major powers, states now find it necessary to increase their control of economic sectors considered strategic and security sensitive. And more sectors are being considered security sensitive as this competition accelerates. Thirdly, the increased risk of a balkanization of the global economy, meaning its splintering and disintegration into smaller and competing ecosystems. So an increasing decoupling between economies, for instance, with regards to technological standards and supply chains. Together with global supply chains, technical standard setting forms the backbone of economic globalization by establishing the sort of interoperability of different economic networks. The SWIFT system being one example that possibilitates the financial transactions worldwide, or standards allowing us to utilize our mobile phones, or so even the global flow of trade needs standards, ports and airports, so to speak. This standardization process has traditionally been a very bottom-up sort of technocratic approach led by the industries themselves, and very much Western industries, US and European. Now we increasingly see a distinct approach to standard setting in the making, which much more involves the state, and particularly the Chinese state perhaps taking a more strategic approach to standard setting and feeding more competition over global standards, perhaps especially in the technological domain. So together these three trends, weaponization, securitization, the balkanization of the global economy, very much changes the operating environment for European companies. In the second chapter of this report, we then kind of survey the bundle of new policy instruments that the EU has recently been developing and that we heard some of the instruments here before under the banner of the so-called open strategic autonomy in order to cope with the rise of geoeconomics. So how it attempts to manage its interdependence with the outside world. And here we make a distinction between what we call the EU's new economic defense capabilities and its more perhaps offensive even strategic policies. And this table shows a summary of these policies and instruments, some of which are still being discussed, but nevertheless it certainly indicates that the EU is very much in the process of adapting to the rise of geoeconomics, mostly by deploying defensive measures to protect itself from unfair trade practices and economic coercion, but also increasingly weighing options for a more assertive use of a strategic economic toolkit. So the big question here really is where this weighing exercise, where the balance in this new toolkit ends up, and when the EU seeks to hedge against the risks associated here. Balancing with the open market policies, and this is the big question, of course, how to combine more self-assertive policies with the more market liberal and rules-based principles of the European integration process. At present, some of the initiatives floated clearly come from perhaps a bit more of a market interventionist philosophy, while others build on more market liberal perspective. And here we urge Finnish policymakers to be very active in this debate, because where this policy balance ends up is not trivial by any means to Finnish interests. We also take a look at Finland's own national approach to manage its interdependencies, with particular focus on the security of supply and resilience policies. And also here, perhaps Finland has some kind of refiguring to do to better align its market liberal outlook with the shifting landscape of global economic relations, and perhaps the increasingly state interventionist political balance in the EU. Part 2 of this report engages very much in data analysis, gathering data on European and especially Finnish economic and technological dependencies, taking stock of some critical strengths and vulnerabilities in this regard. So for Chapter 4, we have collected and analyzed data concerning Finnish economic relations and dependencies with regard to China, the US, and the European Union. So analyzing kind of general economic interdependencies. And what this analysis essentially shows is, first of all, and quite obviously, how important the EU is for the Finnish economy. But then when comparing China and the United States, it's interesting to note how the United States has become relatively more important than China during the past decade. And indeed how the United States is much more important for the Finnish economy right now than China. So for Finnish value added, the US is much more important source than China. And this has to do with the fact that Finland exports more value added mid-tech products to US, where it exports a lot of resource-based, agri-based products to China. That's one. And this is a change when we compare to 10 to 20 years ago, when Finnish exports to China actually were still dominated by high-tech industries, high-tech electronics, and this is not the case anymore. From the data, we can also note how, despite all the rhetoric around decoupling between China and the US, on this broader economic level, there are actually not that many signs of it. But when we, later in the report, look more specifically at the technological domain, it appears that's where the decoupling actually is happening in the technological domain. Chapters 5 and 6 of this report is really where we then zoom in on this technological domain. In Chapter 5, we're looking at the technological cooperation and competition between China and the US and Europe's role in it. And we're trying to map especially Finland's technological competences and then also its cooperation with especially China and the United States. The chapter contains a wealth of data. I can't possibly do justice of that analysis here. I just point out couple of things coming out from this analysis. First, despite being a global science leader, knowledge valorization is a problem for Europe. including Finland. So the ability to effectively bring the know-how and technologies to the market. In fact, it seems that much of the economic benefits of Europe's large investments in science and technology are reaped outside Europe. And this then, of course, also gives a certain spin to the debate around the need to perhaps develop Europe's technological sovereignty. Secondly, our data suggests a potentially accelerating technological decoupling between large parts of Europe and the United States, which is interesting in itself. And at the same time, we note stronger technological coupling between parts of Northern Europe, including Finland and China. We also note some risks involved with this increasing technological dependence on China, some of which have materialized already. Thirdly, we note on the basis of our data how both China and the United States are very active in developing key emerging technologies, such as quantum technologies, that we can assume to play a major role in the future in any geoeconomic competition or geopolitical for that matter. And how there's strikingly little cooperation between the superpowers in this field. Striking is also how Europe seems to lag behind in these critical technologies, including Finland. There are hardly any patents at all. Finally, we note how from the perspective of Finland, again, the EU comes across as key for the future development and competitiveness of Finnish technological competences, and how indeed much depend on the EU's ability to step up its technological game in its competition with US and China. Finally, in chapter 6, we look at the acquisitions of major US and Chinese-based technology companies in Europe. Why is this important? Well, it's important because the behavior of these technology giants, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft on the one hand, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent on the other hand, their entry and behavior in European markets can be assumed to have a major effect on European technological competitiveness over the longer term. And that again will of course directly affect Europe's ability to compete in this geoeconomics/geopolitical game. So here we note how the big tech companies quite aggressively are actually buying up European companies, particularly in software and mobile business, chiefly US-based tech giants, but increasingly also Chinese-based tech giants. And these trends are slightly alarming, of course, because often it terminates European innovation and kills competition. And it seems that many of these buyouts of smaller European companies are indeed targeted to terminate their innovation and ensure that they will not pose a future competitive threat to these external tech giants. And these killer acquisitions span a broad variety of sectors, including energy, healthcare, financial services, so on, sectors in which European, including Finnish companies, have tended to have a comparative advantage. Now to conclude with, I just quickly want to present some of the policy implications that we draw from our analysis in this report. And the key challenge here is really indeed the balancing of economic openness on the one hand, preparedness on the other hand. So maintaining our open economic platform on the one hand to ensure kind of continuous economic development, while simultaneously enhancing our preparedness to economic disruptions and risks that are coupled with critical external economic dependencies. So with a view to this challenge, we specifically propose 4 bundles of policy recommendations. First, introducing national economic risk assessments. National risk assessments in the EU countries usually consider a wide range of traditional risk, but they seldom incorporate sort of new novel sources of geoeconomic risk. And here it is essential to include the private sector that are in the forefront of these risks and responsible for the majority of critical economic infrastructure and services, for instance. So we really need to develop a better joint situational awareness between public and private actors as a key pillar of economic preparedness. Secondly, increasing strategic coordination of technological governance. So we see China and the US fiercely competing for technological edge, advantage over each other, even technological containment of each other. For the EU and its member states, this warrants perhaps a stronger focus on developing a measure of technological sovereignty, while at the same time maintaining a measure of open cooperation in order to improve competitiveness and innovation. And this is where Europe faces a coordination challenge. Technology sourcing and investments needs to be improved and stepped up. The Finnish government has set a target of 4% R&D expenditures by 2030, but currently we do not really seem to be on the way to that target, in fact. And the question is whether even that target is set too low, considering what competitors are doing. A key observation made in this report is also that compared to its European peers, Finland has an exceptionally high co-owned patent portfolio or co-owned patent share with Chinese-based actors, and this is potentially somewhat problematic in certain ways. Thirdly, promoting trade cooperation. As with many EU member states, Finland is critically dependent on international trade, which is why an open and rules-based global trading system is a matter of very central importance. For the EU as a whole, but especially I think for its smaller export-oriented member states such as Finland, extending existing trade agreements thus remains vital. Finally, ensuring level playing field for European companies. This is of course vital for ensuring Europe's future competitiveness. At present, this level playing field is challenged in a number of ways. First, as said before, a growing number of aggressive acquisitions by tech giants risks slowing down European innovation and perhaps even kill potential European competitors. Secondly, the EU struggles to adapt and reap benefits from the digital revolution due to a number of factors, and we see, and this also involves kind of the competition over global standards. We see that particularly Chinese-based, heavily subsidized companies often gain an unfair advantage over European companies, and the Chinese government's increasing activity in global standard setting organizations is also an increasing problem from a European point of view, and the EU and Finland needs to become much more strategic about this issue and be prepared to defend European values also in the context of technical standard setting. So these were some of the key takeaways from this report, this very extensive and data-heavy report. I invite everybody to take a look at it. Indeed, it contains a lot, and I think it provides us with perhaps some very useful empirics as well to base our discussion on around this accelerating economic and technological rivalry from a European Finnish point of view, at least. So now we'll be continuing with our panel discussion around this topic. We have an extremely knowledgeable panel who will give their remarks on the risks and options for the EU and perhaps especially Finland in managing its economic and technological interdependencies. Sari Arho-Havrén, Senior Advisor at Business Finland, joining us from Brussels, and with 15 years of work experience from mainland China and Hong Kong. Janne Känkänen, CEO since 2020 at the Finnish National Emergency Supply Agency, having before worked in several positions at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment. And Petri Vuorio, Director of Entrepreneurship, Industrial Policy and EU Affairs at the Confederation of Finnish Industries, ECO, with a vast previous experience working as a corporate banker for Nordic banks in Russia, and also currently the chair of the Russia Working Group at Business Europe, and previously also secretary of the China-Finland Innovation Committee. I'm really happy that you all could join us to this discussion. And let's start with Sari, if you would like to start with some comments of your own, and then we go in the order of Janne and Petri. And lastly, we can have a bit of an open debate. I remind everybody you can post questions, comments in the chat function. I will be kind of picking it up from there. So Sari, go ahead.
Congratulations for this excellent report. The authors have done tremendously interesting work, and I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in this panel. I will take a little different view here than the earlier speakers, which and a little bit future-leaning position here, a foresight, because I'm a futurist, but also because of my own background is in geopolitics, specializing in China's foreign relations, which echo with this launch paper. And also China as a future change agent will thus take a central role in my little briefing here. I will shortly touch two angles. Firstly, backcast a future in about 15 years from now. What does a China-centric future would look like for Europe in a situation where we have failed to change the current trajectory, being not so favorably positioned between the US and China's great power competition? This scenario is based on China's policy papers and actions, and maybe a little thought-provoking. And let's thus keep in mind that this is indeed a scenario where we have not been able to influence our own future, or for instance, the defense capabilities are for some reason or other not implemented thoroughly. Secondly, and in the end, I will touch about the future drivers that I see in my own foresight work that have connect points to this FIIA paper. First of all, open market liberalism, democracies and the model of governance in the Western societies are all under an attack as we speak. Democracies have been in decline for the past 15 years. Leaders from China and Russia too have publicly said in multiple occasions that they do not accept the rules-based order that was designed by the US and its allies. Instead, China requires that the new international order should mirror the increased global status of China. In reality, this of course means that this new order would protect the Chinese Communist Party and secure its power at home so that it will not be challenged from the outside. In the arena of great power competition, I argue China aims to replace the United States as the global leader. I do not believe that China aims to become a hegemony on a par with the United States. China indeed talks about being an equal power. Xi Jinping himself talks about China as a world power, and he talks about a multipolar world, but this does not mean an equal multipolar world, although the multipolarity no doubt pleases the European policymakers. But perhaps even more, it blurs us from understanding the real meaning behind, which is China-led multipolar world order, where our role becomes a subsidiary. In the great power competition in general, there are no equal powers. It is a competition by definition. With this background, it is in China's fundamental interest to divide Europe and influence each European country individually and separately, simply to weaken them and to drive a wedge between the transatlantic alliance in order to maintain this weakness. From a Beijing point of view, vis-à-vis Europe, only one future scenario is acceptable. China wants to strengthen its influence in Europe, which would serve its overall policy objectives back home. These include multiple areas such as trade and technology, well covered in this FIIA report. But also China aims at eroding the legitimacy of human rights, universal human rights, concept of rule of law, concept of democracy, fundamentals of the European societies, while it wants to portray itself as having a superior model of governance. All this will help it to build a China-centric world order and become a hegemon in its own right. If we look at this trajectory in about 15 years by 2035, which is a middle target for China towards 2050, and assuming that Europe has not been able to push back unanimously, we can easily see that China's clout in Europe will be considerably increased from what it is now. By then, China would have increased also its power in the geographies surrounding Europe. China's current Middle East policy is a good example of this already by now. Democracies would have been in decline for almost 3 decades by that time and represent only a minority of countries. Most European countries would still be democracies, but weak ones, while China would require not to challenge it politically, and self-censorship would have become a norm throughout the European institutions, academia, and governments. And gradually, universal human rights in international institutions would be adjusted to China's definition of human rights that would lack, for instance, freedom of speech and civil and political rights. What we are going to see is that this decoupling will continue. We are witnessing already forming of new defense alliances, especially in the Pacific region that was mentioned already earlier today. And these are already spilling over into new trade pacts. For instance, the initiative between the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, CANZUK. All this indicates that the liberal trading system that respects the rules-based order will remain, but remain in partially closed trading blocks, which will be organized geographically, like regional blocks or around shared strategic interest and common political values. Then we will have the China-centric bloc that is organized around a conflicting value system, where China is basically backing regional authoritarian countries to grant them credibility in order to show its own people that its political ideology is superior. So in this new geopolitical situation, the dissonance between openness and resilience, or openness or even the spooky protectionism, further underlines the value and importance of this FIIA report that was published today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sari. I can't help myself but putting one question to you immediately here. The CAI agreement. What's your view on where do we stand on that agreement, and how do you see it?
Well, as we all know, we are likely not to see it to going forward at the moment. The value of it is greatly debated, whether it's really can achieve the goals that it has been promising, especially if we talk about the forced labor matters there. Of course, it would be a bottom line that would open then a dialogue to challenge the areas that are not kept. But at the moment, in this current situation, we are witnessing so many new hurdles that it's very difficult to see that it would go forward.
Thanks. Janne, do you prefer to speak from here or from up here?
Whatever suits you. I can speak from there. I have a mic here. So
yeah, you can. Yeah, sure.
It's up to you. Okay. So first of all, I mean, thank you very much for the invitation. Isn't this an interesting and topical piece of research? I think it certainly is. So I think it's particularly fitting, and also fitting to sort of analyze this from the perspective of resilience. So I'm going to more sort of focus on resilience issues. Obviously, since my background is from that field of work. Maybe not a note on resilience, because I think it's a sort of an important concept also around this work. I would sort of divide it into two. Firstly, the kind of from a more narrow perspective, if you look at how economies like Finland can withstand different types of crisis and disruption situations, the ability to actually cope with this kind of crisis, that kind of represents resilience. On the other hand, resilience is also to do with the fact that economies can be competitive. Europe can be competitive. Finland can be a robust economy. Europe can have a strong dynamic internal market, which in a way contributes to the overall resilience of the economy and the economic model. Also reflecting on the previous speaker's points on how Europe can in a way respond to the China challenge. So there are different views on how we can and maybe should look at the concept of resilience. Our agency, and I come from the, as said, from the National Emergency Supply Agency, we deal with the resilience from this more narrow perspective mainly. Our job really is, and I'm referring to the Director General's remarks earlier when she mentioned a sort of a shift from just-in-time to just-in-case business. So we are certainly in the just-in-case business. And our task is really to ensure that Finland's kind of critical sectors can withstand different types of crisis and disruption situations. And we do this with the help of our extensive partner network consisting of Finnish companies deemed to be critical for resilience and security of supply, and through our other activities based on our balance sheet and fund for security of supply. One could say that the long-term trend really in the Finnish security of supply and also in the resilience field has certainly been a shift in focus from the sort of traditional material preparedness, which consists mainly of stockpiling, production reservations, are still very important. But there's a trend towards business continuity management, also securing digital networks, role of different network type of operations overall, and also robustness of value chains, which was also figured in the research quite extensively. In addition, there's certain macro level trends that can be and should be mentioned. Obviously, climate change, but also the sort of digitalization of everything create additional challenges to resilience and security of supply, and those also demand new solutions and also new platforms so that we can solve those. Private companies really that design, build, operate and maintain critical functions are really integral parts of national resilience, and thereby also targets of malign influencing, which was mentioned also in the study on the research. Risk assessments, continuity policies, preparedness plans and exercises are something that can be in the toolkit to also take these risks into account. Foreign direct investments were mentioned, acquisitions. This is also a very important topical issue from the perspective of resilience. FDIs directed towards critical enterprises obviously are a key consideration. And I would say that nations generally need to have tools to prevent those types of acquisitions or takeovers that can be critical and can be kind of harmful for national security, but also for resilience in the broader sense. On the other hand, I would say that one should not forget that the FDIs are also a tool to encourage economic development and drive economic prosperity. So I think it's again the other side of the coin. It's also important to note that resilience, be it at the national level or at the EU level, cannot be achieved in isolation. And I think the kind of open network-based interdependent economic model also makes it necessary to coordinate national resilience measures. And I think this is becoming ever more topical now when we face these challenges that were also elegantly mentioned by the previous speakers. So one could also, in a way, say that resilience represents, in a way, the other side of the coin. On the other side, you have the openness, you have the benefits of open economies, open trade policies, and so forth. But in today's reality, you need to look at the resilience side of the coin as well, very carefully. At the same time, also the open model gives us access to multiple sources, alternative sources also of supply. That, in a way, enabling flexibility and dynamism, and thereby also improving resilience. However, the current sort of a great power rivalry that was very extensively mentioned here before Also risks to significantly lessen this positive effect, and I think this certainly increases the need for national and regional policies in this field. Let's say then, and to conclude from the practitioner's point of view, definitely the recent EU policy level, the EU level policy measures and the openings aimed at increasing Europe's sort of self-sufficiency and resilience. This means the CER directive, FDI monitoring tool, but also in a broader perspective, Digital Markets Act, just to name the few, are certainly very welcome, and I think it's a good development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I think it very well came across that resilience is not a matter necessarily of increasing any self-sufficiency, but that it benefits from an open environment as well, and that's good to keep in mind. Preparedness has to do also with benefits from open markets, and very much. So let's continue with Petri Vuorio. Please, Petri, go ahead.
Good afternoon, and thank you for invitation, and thank you, Mikael, and the team for this very valuable work and impressive report. So in my introduction, I will shortly cover three areas. First of all, what is the impact of US-China great power competition on Finnish business? And secondly, well, what to expect from the developing partnership between China and Russia? And then third point, what are the EU's opportunities to qualify in the technological competition? Starting from the first point, like referring to FIIA in the beginning, we recently published a joint study with Finnish Foreign Ministry on impact of US-China great power competition to Finnish businesses. And we identified several main areas where we see impact: sanctions, finance, export control, standardization, and market access. First, US sanctions to China have direct and indirect impact on Finnish companies that do business with China. Some Finnish companies have already been forced to change their supply chains because of the decoupling effect of US sanctions. And then secondly, financial sector is the best example where a strong position of US and US dollar in the global financial system helps to enforce the US Treasury sanctions to cover also European banking sector and companies by this. To comply with sanctions, I would say that the business needs to invest a lot in compliance and knowing their customers, supply chains and finances in the future. The US and China are also Finland's most important exporting markets for dual-use goods. And recently, we know that US has strengthened export restrictions to Chinese companies, and as a result, some Finnish companies have already needed to cancel some export deals. China has also established its own export control law recently, and this may lead to a situation when European companies may need to choose which export control law not to comply with. And then fourth and final point, both China and the US have increased their, let's say, intensivity in standardization. This may lead to a situation where standards would separate in these two different markets, and this would create challenges for SMEs especially to have two different product lines for two different markets. Then the second topic that is very actual that we follow up closely, business cannot avoid being very concerned on tensions in Ukraine, and if the situation would escalate, we very well know that the sanctions of UK, US and EU would be harder than 2014 and also hit European business harder. So one question is then what happens between China as great power and Russia as regional power in the future. We have seen their trade and technological cooperation accelerate since 2014. Actually, China's share of the Russian foreign trade has doubled since that, from 10% to 20%. Also technological cooperation, artificial intelligence, big data, Huawei and Russian government doing cooperation in Aurora ecosystem. There are many examples. Close partnership with dominant China is not naturally optimal for Russia, but we can also ask that what are Russia's options? China shares similar views on new world order and this kind of issues. It is also still growing customer of fossil fuels and EU is not. In case of, let's say, if we would see technology export restrictions as a result of this conflict, it would not be difficult to guess where are these replaced from these Western technologies. So to sum up, currently 7 out of the world's 10 largest companies are American tech companies. Number 11 is Chinese Tencent. And when we look at the European tech companies, the best one is ranked number 30, and there are only two companies in top 100 when we measure these by market capitalization. So a big question is, how do we improve our competitiveness to stay on board in this technological competition? There probably are no other answers, or we have seen good points today, but one is also to further strengthen our existing strengths. First of all, functionality of the digital single market, there definitely is still a lot to do. We need to also expand our technology capacity. It is essential to provide incentives and conditions for long-term investment, including R&D funding, venture capital market, where we lag behind US and China currently. Then well-functioning global value chains are vital for us. And of course, defending multilateral world order is a priority as part of this. We need to use the power of single market to still negotiate more good trade agreements, and what's also important, to implement those carefully. And let's not forget Brussels effect. I think we are not necessarily the leading innovator right now, but we are still leading regulator. So we need to be awake and more strategic in standardization, and yesterday's announcement about EU standardization strategy is an attempt to do this and remain EU's position as a standard setter instead of standard taker in the future. Thank you.
The Brussels effect, referring of course to the regulatory power of the EU, and this is a phrase coined by Anu Bradford, a Finnish, very well-known, internationally well-known researcher who has much investigated that and how companies around the world starts kind of following EU regulations at best. The question is, of course, do we see the Brussels effect? Petri, this is actually a question for you. What about the Brussels effect going forward? Is it slowing down? Is it weakening the Brussels effect, or is it equally strong? Or how do you see the future of the Brussels effect?
Well, I think that the effect has been strong, and we have great examples like GDPR recently. But I mean, we need to work hard. I mean that we are challenged in this area, and others are taking a stronger role. So we need to definitely pay attention not to lose the strength of the Brussels effect.
A final question to Janne about the so-called Critical Entities Resilience Directive, the CER directive, which was, I believe, in December put out, and it's now kind of changing a bit, perhaps, how going forward with security supply in Europe, and it might also have some effects on Finland and our security supply system. So how do you see the CER directive? Will it entail a lot of changes to our systems present, or how do you see it going?
Well, thanks for the question. I think the jury is still out there as far as the, let's say, exact changes are concerned, but this is a ongoing process. We are evaluating the way in which the Finnish system should be sort of aligned with the requirements that will originate from the directive. I think one should not forget that it is still in a negotiation phase. It's not yet approved. there's going to be a 3-year sort of an implementation period. But during that time, I think we have a good opportunity to make sure that what is quite unique in the Finnish system, and that is the network of companies deemed critical for resilience and security of supply, working on a, say, voluntary basis, but in an organized way to make sure that the critical sectors indeed are resilient and they have the abilities and capabilities in place that different types of crisis and disruption situations can be responded in an efficient manner. This is at the heart of the Finnish kind of resilience model, and I think we obviously would like to make sure and would like to ensure that the benefits that exist in the existing Finnish model can be preserved. At the same time, I think it's a very welcome development that Europe has taken this step to actually put forward the directive, and the resilience is now going to be kind of encoded in the national legislation. There's going to be kind of a more or less uniform approach to making sure that at least the minimum level of resilience sort of enhancing activities are done in a coordinated, organized manner throughout Europe. And I think it's necessarily will improve the overall situation with all the other sort of policy measures that can and are going to be important. From what I mentioned from the more narrow perspective of resilience per se, perhaps security of supply and around that concept, but also resilient in the more broader sense that is to do with how economy works, how important and how robust economy Europe can be within the global economy.
Good. And it's 2:00, so we're closing down this seminar. Just perhaps a final note on also Petri alluded to the MFA EK report that was done before this, our report and project, and I think this is very much a continuation of that work that you already did, and which was very valuable in creating awareness of this changing environment. And this is of course a sort of a continuation of that. At FIIA we're continuing with this work as well. We have, as Mika Aaltola mentioned, to start with, we began this new project with EU Commission funding, also that tries to identify and come up with new tools to identify and monitor geoeconomic risk, and that's a very interesting and quite exciting project in fact. So thanks a lot to all the participants and speakers, and goodbye.